Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Human Services. I'm MLA Larry Doak, and I'm your chair for today's meeting. I'd like to introduce committee members. First, MLA Nadine Wilson. Second, the Honourable Todd Gowdy. Third member today is MLA Mohammed Fayaz. Our fourth member today is MLA Herb Cox. And we have MLA Carla Beck. Today we are considering the estimates and supplementary estimates for the Ministry of Education, Vote 5, Education, Central Management and Services, and Subvote ED01. Minister Wyant is here with his officials. Due to physical distancing requirements in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, witnesses may speak at the stand-up microphone podium if they are required to answer questions. I would ask that all witnesses to please state their names for the record before speaking at the microphone. If the minister needs to confer with officials in private, the minister may use the hallway or the vestibule at the chamber main entrance. Minister, please introduce your officials and make your opening comments.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here today to speak to the Ministry of Education's 2020-21 budget. With me today, certainly to help answer any questions that the committee members have, to my right, Rob Curry, Deputy Minister, and members of his team from the ministry who will introduce themselves at the microphone should they be required to speak. And then my Chief of Staff, Julie Leggett, behind me. I want to thank them for all the work that they do to support me as the minister and the work that they do to support the children of this province. It's certainly greatly appreciated. My role as Minister of Education for Saskatchewan has been nothing short of eventful, and these last few months have certainly stood up to that reputation. That's why I'd like to take the first few moments this evening to review the significant developments since March, as well as developments of the past year, and then embark on a clear direction for the next decade of education in Saskatchewan. In response to COVID-19, when the Ministry of Education, under the direction of Saskatchewan's Chief Medical Health Officer, Dr. Shahab, announced the indefinite discontinuance of in-class learning beginning March 20th due to the ongoing global pandemic, this decision was not made lightly. The continued support of our students, our teachers, and our school staff and communities, along with the response planning team, has been absolutely exceptional. As the response planning team prepares students and staff for a return to in-class learning this fall, with room for contingencies, I could not be more satisfied with what they've accomplished. As we enter yet another week navigating this pandemic, the Ministry of Education continues to ensure that Saskatchewan's pre-K to grade 12 education, early learning, and library and literacy sectors are well cared for. This budget addresses the growth in our schools while also helping to stimulate our province's recovery. This funding will not only support our students and our teachers, it will also plan for the future of education by making a significant investment in new schools. With that said, the Government of Saskatchewan has spent the last year enveloped in the progress of our education, early years, library and literacy sectors. The Government of Saskatchewan's momentum toward building stronger communities for the people of Saskatchewan is unwavering, and the Ministry of Education will continue to see this through. After a long-year engagement process that involved contributions from thousands of Saskatchewan residents, including students, parents, teachers, educational stakeholders, Indigenous leaders, and the business community, we are very pleased to roll out the priorities that they have identified for Saskatchewan classrooms over the next decade. The Ministry of Education's framework for a provincial education plan, 2020 to 2030, is a foundation based on having every Saskatchewan student feel that they are learning what they need for their future, that they belong, can be themselves, and that they are valued, safe, and supported. To build a stronger Saskatchewan, the 2021-21 budget will support Saskatchewan's pre-K to grade 12 classrooms, early learning and childcare and library sectors. This includes a significant investment of $2.6 billion into the Ministry of Education this fiscal year, which is an increase of $123.3 million, or 5%. We recently announced our plan to stimulate Saskatchewan's economic recovery due to COVID-19. This stimulus package includes $136.3 million for the Ministry of Education over 2 years, of which $37.3 million will be invested in 2021. Keeping the students needs in mind, the work of the Curriculum Advisory Committee will continue into 2021 and will ensure that students are prepared for success in a 21st century economy. In addition, we will welcome a brand new group of diverse student leaders as members of the Youth Council to share their perspectives on education and identify important issues to them. Students have a critical voice in education and an important role to play in improving the future of Saskatchewan. During these unprecedented times, I've seen innovations and camaraderie among individuals and organizations across the province, which gives me hope that Saskatchewan education is experiencing great progression. We will continue to work together with our partners in education to address any and all challenges, ensuring that we are supporting our students for successful futures within the province. For the 2020-21 school year, 27 school divisions across Saskatchewan will receive $1.94 billion, which is an increase of $42.1 million from last year's education budget, including $20 million to fully fund the new teachers agreement. And that is an astonishing $525 million increase since 2007. We will also be allocating $11.8 million in operating grants to our qualified independent schools and historical high schools, which is an increase of $1.3 million from the previous year. The increased operating grant will ensure that all school divisions, qualified independent schools, and historical high schools are able to address changes in enrollment and inflation, as well as further align historical high school funding to that of associate schools. With that said, I'm proud to announce that once again, Saskatchewan schools will see the largest operating investment in our province's history. Within this year's operating investment, we will maintain our commitment to inclusive and supportive learning environments for all students via the Supports for Learning funding model. This includes $289.1 million this year, an increase of $3.3 million over the 2019-20 school year, to address the intensive needs of students with cognitive, physical, and/or psychological challenges, as well as vulnerable students experiencing barriers to learning success due to social, economic, emotional, and behavioral issues. Likewise, the Ministry of Education is providing additional funding on top of the 2020-21 operating grant to support a number of mental health and wellness initiatives for students. We are also collaborating interministerially to engage community-based organizations and support students in building healthy relationships and providing mental health supports and services. In 2020-21, the Ministry of Education will provide $106.2 million to these service providers, which is an increase of $2.4 million from last year. While a majority of our operating grant is targeted toward K-12 education due to a larger enrollment, the Government of Saskatchewan's 2020-21 budget will also provide $20.8 million for pre-K students, an increase of $109,000. This will continue to support the 316 pre-K programs across the province, which serve about 5,000 3- and 4-year-olds. For our residents in their earliest years, the 2020-21 budget will provide $98 million in funding for multiple early years programs and supports, including $73.5 million for licensed care, including an increase of $1.7 million to existing child care centres with operating costs. $350,000 for specialized programs for pre-kindergarten children with intensive needs, $4.4 million for early childhood intervention programs to help the 14 ISIPs across the province assist more children in overcoming developmental delays and enhancing the ability of children experiencing disabilities. $16.6 million for the Kids First program, an increase of $399,000. $2.9 million for child nutrition programs in 19 school divisions and 26 community-based organizations, and $2.6 million in continued funding for 3 family resource centers in Regina, Sandy Bay, and Yorkton, as well as funding provided by the Canada Saskatchewan Early Learning and Child Care. That's why we worked diligently this past year to establish a new contract for teachers, which balances the government's appreciation and respect for teachers with the fiscal responsibility management that taxpayers expect. On May 21st, 2020, Saskatchewan teachers ratified their agreement with the Government of Saskatchewan. That agreement includes a 2% salary increase in 2021, 2022, and 2023, and is in addition to the 1% salary increase the teachers received on August 1st, 2019, the last day of their previous contract. In addition to this agreement, a new class size and composition committee which was recently developed. This new committee is moving into phase 2 of their work as they discuss potential options to address the challenges related to class size and composition planning in Saskatchewan's pre-K to grade 12 classes. The goal of this work will be to find solutions to better meet the needs of students, teachers, and staff in Saskatchewan schools, and to have a planned implementation by the fall of 2021. We are hopeful that together we can address the issues surrounding class complexity. In addition to supporting the operational needs within our schools, we have also provided substantial investments in school infrastructure to ensure that our learning and working environments for students and staff are both safe and inspiring. To accomplish this, the 2020-21 budget will provide $130.4 million in capital funding to build 7 new schools and renovate 3 existing schools, an increase of $34.8 million from 2019-20. This funding includes $8.5 million to begin planning and design on a new joint use facility for 2 elementary schools in Regina's Harbor Landing neighborhood, a new K-12 school to consolidate the elementary school and high school in Carrot River, renovations to the Yorkton Regional High School, renovations and an addition to John Paul II Collegiate in North Battleford, a new elementary school to replace Princess Alexandra, King George, and Pleasant Hill Elementary School in Saskatoon, a joint use facility with 2 elementary schools to replace St. Peter, St. Michael, and Imperial schools here in the city of Regina, a new school to replace St. Francis Elementary School in Saskatoon, and renovations and an addition to Athol Murray College in Notre Dame. It also includes $500,000 to assess the current state of high schools in the city of Regina and Saskatoon and determine the future high school needs for East Regina and East Saskatoon. $46.9 million to provide ongoing funding for 4 major school consolidation projects underway in Rostern, Weyburn, Moose Jaw, and Regina, and $10.6 million for relocatable classrooms. Regarding the ongoing projects, I'm pleased to announce that the new school in Rostern is just wrapping up construction, and the new school in Weyburn is expected to be completed in the spring of next year. Furthermore, design teams have been selected for both new school projects in Regina and Moose Jaw, with extensive community consultation undertaken for each. In addition to major capital needs, we're continuing to invest in preventative maintenance, renewal, and emergency funding for our schools. $62.9 million will be allocated between divisions in 2020-21, which will ensure that Saskatchewan boards of education are proactive in addressing critical rehabilitation and maintenance projects. This includes $12 million through the new Climate Action Incentive Fund agreement between the Government of Canada and Saskatchewan, which is financed by proceeds of the federal carbon tax. School divisions will be able to access the funding for projects that align with our Made in Saskatchewan strategy to address climate change and support energy efficiency as soon as their projects are approved by the federal government. We're also thrilled to announce that in addition to funding initially committed to capital projects in 2020-2021, the Government of Saskatchewan has implemented a 2-year capital plan to support building stronger communities while simultaneously stimulating Saskatchewan's economic recovery from the impact of COVID-19. Over the span of 2 years, educational infrastructure will receive $136.3 million, which will go to support 6 new capital projects, including a new Francophone elementary school in the city of Regina, a new elementary school to replace Ducharme Elementary School in Laloche, a new K-12 school to replace Blaine Lake Composite School, a new K-12 school to consolidate the elementary school and high school in Lanigan, renovations and additions to Holy Rosary High School in Lloydminster, and renovations and addition to the Lloydminster Comprehensive High School, as well as $16.9 million for renovation maintenance projects around the province. The Ministry of Education has also been working closely with the Conseil in order to ensure that quality education is provided for Francophone families. We are continuing to work collaboratively with them on project plans to determine the best options between Regina, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert. Since 2013, the Government of Saskatchewan has continued to fund initiatives in response to the Joint Task Force recommendations on improving education and employment outcomes for First Nations and Métis people in Saskatchewan. This year, the 2020-21 budget is providing $5.1 million for those initiatives. One of those of which is Following Their Voices, which will be receiving $2.1 million and focuses on changing student-teacher relationships, instructional practices, and the learning environment in order to engage and support students. I'm proud to say that since Following Their Voices started in 2014, there have been 51 schools involved with the participation of over 800 school staff and 14,000 students, 8,600 of which self-declaring as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, as well as a 12.5% increase in credit attainment and a 14.3% increase in three-year graduation rates. The Ministry has also allocated $2.4 million toward the Invitational Shared Services Initiatives, which brings together the provincial education system and 17 First Nations education authorities to support students living on reserve. The Ministry will also be providing $300,000 to the continued support of Help Me Tell a Story and Help Me Talk About Math, innovative, holistic, and interactive engagement initiatives for pre-K, kindergarten, and grade 1 children and their families to promote ongoing development of literacy and math skills. $200,000 will be allocated to the continuing support of Leading to Learn, which is designed to provide capacity-building professional learning opportunities for school administrators that enable them to make a positive impact on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. To round out our funding initiatives in response to the Joint Task Force recommendations, $137,000 is being provided to extend the Microsoft licensing agreement within all First Nations kindergarten to grade 12 schools. We continue to support literacy province-wide. Public libraries of Saskatchewan will receive $11.3 million, an increase of 1% or $84,000 from last year, while the provincial literacy programs will receive $1 million. These allocations ensure that residents across the province have access to library services, whether it be for hard copies of their favorite novel, free digital services for persons with disabilities, or access to shared resources. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, the Government of Saskatchewan's drive toward building stronger communities for the people of Saskatchewan is outstanding. We will continue to thrive off this fortitude as we continue into the new decade of education and a new normal for everyone. My ministry colleagues and I will be working diligently with our partners in education to ensure that our students are prepared for their futures, and this year's budget is sure to maintain those efforts. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes my opening comments, and I look forward to the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Move to questions now. Ms. Beck.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And thank you to Mr. Curry and all of your officials that are here with you today. Minister, I will acknowledge the fact that it has been a very eventful term that you've presided over as the Education Minister, and I know that these are extraordinary times that have asked a lot of everyone in the K-12 sector within the ministry and outside the ministry, and I do want to sincerely thank everyone for their efforts. They have not gone unnoticed, and I know that there has been a great deal of collaboration that has happened to make sure that a plan came together in a very fast way for a scenario that none of us could have anticipated. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to try to organize myself. As you imagine, I have a few questions for you. I'm going to start in with just some questions around allocations and FTEs within the ministry. Were there any increases or decreases in terms of FTEs within the ministry this year?
There were no apparent additions or reductions to FTEs within the ministry.
Any secondments?
There were 5 secondments into the Ministry of Education.
Are those secondments, excuse me, attached to any particular projects?
Were attached to following their voices, and 1 attached for the library work that's being done.
I know this might be a lengthy answer, but can you describe some of the major initiatives that are being undertaken by the ministry right now? I think of following their voices, as you've mentioned, the work towards a new ed sector plan goal, the curriculum renewal process.
I'll ask Deputy Minister Curry to address the question, particularly around the provincial education plan, which he has been leading on behalf of the ministry and doing an outstanding job. So I'll let Deputy Minister Curry speak to that.
Thanks, Minister. A very major initiative has been the ongoing work towards a provincial education plan. In May of 2018, the minister convened a meeting with our education sector partners. This was quite a significant catalyst to start the conversation and the engagement with regards to a new provincial education plan that would guide our education structure through 2020 to 2030. The partners that were invited, our education sector partners invited to that meeting, included the Saskatchewan School Boards Association, the Saskatchewan Association of School Business Officials, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, the League of Educational Administrators, Directors and Superintendents, FSIN, Office of the Treaty Commissioner, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, as well as the ministry ourselves were invited to that too, and the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. I think I mentioned them too. And this group came together with representatives to speak of how we would approach a level of engagement, receive feedback from the provincial community as to how we would look at developing and ultimately implementing a provincial education plan. So that initially started in May of 2018. In October of 2018, there was called a summit that was held, and that was in Saskatoon. And what was significant of that summit was that there were 160 representatives from all across the province who came together representing 80 different organizations to provide feedback on and insights into their interests and their comments with regards to what a new provincial education plan should include. And what was significant about that was we were planning for the sunsetting of the education sector strategic plan, which was to sunset in June of 2020. So that planning after the summit identified some key areas of focus, and from there we then spent the next number of months where our education sector partners went out to their respective constituents to solicit feedback on what would be considerations in addition to what the summit had provided or landed upon in terms of a focus to be considered for the development and implementation of a future plan. Those feedback items were received. We had well over 30,000 through online, through town hall meetings, and through some email submissions that provided feedback as to what would be of interest. At the same time that engagement process was taking place, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation was hosting its Reimagine program, a project which is also soliciting from teachers and educators across the province and some other non-instructional personnel to what they would think that there would be of interest with regards to the future plan. Of significance was the Reimagine project came up with 12 guidelines, and these 12 guidelines nicely aligned with the 4 pillars that were eventually realized from our provincial education plan framework. When the 12 guidelines were put together with the framework that was released in November of 2019, we then started to look at now what would be the components to drive down to the outcomes to which we would focus within the classrooms and within school divisions learning, as well as providing feedback and consult to the minister. So we had the 4 pillars evolve from the provincial education plan framework. We are now in the process of continuing to work with our education sector partners, driving down deeper into what would be the outcomes, the measures, the governance component that would be realized in terms of addressing education of the future. Due to the pandemic, and you'll probably hear this a few times over the course of the next number of hours, due to the pandemic, our proposed schedule has been affected with our level of engagement with our education sector partners due to them attending to their needs given the pandemic. We have reinstituted continued meetings virtually to come back and have what's called our operational structure, which is our administrative leaders within the province, our directors of education from our First Nations education authorities, those who choose to participate, as well as our provincial school divisions who will be providing insights into what those measures and those outcomes specifically could be. We are at the same time developing an education council. And an education council is a group that is representative of our provincial communities, from education to corporate to parents, to education sector partners, to our post-secondary entities that are coming together to provide a governance oversight to the provincial education plan moving forward and guiding that way. So we look forward to those kind of, from a governance point of view, taking shape and providing foresight for moving into the future. And from an operational point of view, we look for the kind of the action taking place within the school divisions and within the classroom. In the process of developing an education council, as it were, we have what's called, I don't know, I'm giving you another name here, the planning team. And the planning team was of the provincial education plan. And before the education council gets going, the planning team is the entity that has been in existence since the May 2018 meeting. So this is the group that came together, and they've been consistent in participation, in providing feedback and direction as we continue to move forward for this provincial education plan. That's one project.
I'm scared to ask you to detail additional projects. I do have a couple of questions about that. One, with the council, one thing I didn't hear you mention, but I just want to inquire if they are at the table as well. It would be representatives from the early years sector. Are they part of the council?
Yes, by all means they are. We have a Ministry of Education representation, as well as sector representatives that bring the interests and the good information and feedback with regards to early years.
Will the council have a decision-making role or an advisory role?
We'll have an advisory role.
Okay. Do you have an estimation of the funding allocation that has gone towards this project thus far? Different binder. The other question I would have is, and I know we're reading tea leaves here to some extent, but the expectation of when you might have a document for public. I noted in the plan for 2021, it contains the former ed sector plan goals. Just wondering when you might have a rollout of another document.
Released in November of 2019 is the framework, the Provincial Education Plan framework. And that's our North Star, that's our guiding principle for right now, and it has the 4 pillars in it. So that is a document from which we are working at the moment, and that is public. It's posted on our Ministry of Education website. And what we look to have constructed is that would be the document that would speak more specifically to our measurements, outcomes going forward. So right now it's the framework that's been developed, and as again, because of COVID here, our timeline has been pushed back somewhat. So we look to have resumption of the education sector group, the Education Council, as well as the operational structure come together here in August and into September to lead us so that we can have those identified details to which you've referenced in place. Our target is for next January. And then what we would have is that, with the thought being that there would be implementation of those for the fall of 2021.
In just answering your initial question, there's no specific allocation in the budget for this work. The costs are being absorbed in the ministry.
So like for events like the summit and planning like that, that is within the allocation of ministry funds. Okay. Do you expect to see goals similar to the goals that we saw in the former ESSP? Is the first question. And of the education sector goals that sunset, I guess, in this month, can you describe progress towards those goals that was achieved?
In terms of the goals for the education sector strategic plan, those were originally intended to be sunset here in June of this year, 2020. Because of what's happened here over the last number of months, we've readjusted our timelines. So those specific goals will remain in effect until we've moved into the provincial education plan. And we look to have, we are in the midst right now of discussions with our operational structure to craft the specific targeted outcomes, and we remain to have, we are right now in conversation of what specifically those could be. So they're undefined right now, but there has been, at the beginning of March, March 3rd and 4th in Saskatoon, there was a gathering of approximately 100 leaders from our First Nations as well as our provincial school divisions that came together to talk about what could be. And because of the pandemic, we are coming back to the next gathering that would be this fall. So we are looking to define what they would be, and we would look to have those known by January of 2021. The data collection that we had become used to as part of our process with the education sector strategic plan in May and June of collecting data for reading results, as well as obviously graduation, as well as readiness for school. Those were suspended given what happened in March of school changing, as it were. So this year we won't have that same information available to us, with the exception of the graduation results.
Okay, thank you. Is there a report that you can provide on progress or challenges towards meeting those goals as it existed pre-COVID? So, for example, I guess the exiting is difficulty, but how much progress had you made? Of course, we were in the last year of those goals. How much progress had been made, and what were some of the challenges? Where were you seeing that the results that were being achieved perhaps were looking as if they might not meet those goals?
Specific outcomes to which we are targeting work in our strategic plan spoken. I'll just walk through a couple of them right now. One of them was the graduation rates. Our outcome was graduation rates, and As you will recall, by June 30th, 2020, this year, Saskatchewan, our target was to achieve an 85% 3-year graduation rate and a 90% 5-year graduation rate. As of the end of last year, the end of the 18-19 school year, we had a 3-year graduation rate of 77.3%, and we had in the 5-year graduation rate an 84.7%. The 5-year graduation rate was an increase. We have seen continued increases in our 5-year graduation rates for the last 5 years, of which we've been keeping this information. In terms of our 3-year graduation rate, we've seen increases. Well, this last year, we saw a 1%, a 0.1% decline, but we had seen overall an increase significantly thus over the last, the highest over the last 20 years before that. Our First Nations, Métis and Inuit student engagement and retention graduation rates. Our 3-year graduation rate at the end of last year was 43.4%, and that was a slight decline from the year previous, where we had a 44.5%. Our 5-year graduation rate for the First Nations, Métis and Inuit student engagement and graduation rate grouping was, for self-declared, we had 61.0%. and this was the highest it's ever been. There was an increase of just over a half a percent in the 5-year graduation rate. In our reading, writing, and math grade level outcome, our grade 3 reading rate at the end of last year was 75%, and that was a slight increase over the previous number of years. So we stayed a rounded figure at 75, but that had been an actual increase that had been realized to get to that point. And our percentage of students in grade 4 writing at grade level was 62.7%. We had just, that was the second year of that initiative. Our percentage of students in grade 2 doing math at grade level, we had a 71.9%, and that was the first year that we had implemented that measurement. In terms of our early years outcomes, we found that children arriving at kindergarten ready to learn had remained, for all intents and purposes, somewhat static. There was a slight decline of 0.4% of the number of children entering kindergarten ready to learn. That was in the fall. But then when they left, we found that there was a slight increase in their readiness to enter into grade 1, where we are at 79.2%. So we've seen a jump there of 23.2% from when they entered kindergarten to when they left. So they were ready there. Those targets that was the statistical information that we realized from the assessments and the progress of their children and students in the schools. We had targeted for early years that 90% of our children would be ready entering into grade 1, and we are at just under 80% at 79.2.
Thank you for that, Deputy Minister. In terms of the trend for students entering kindergarten ready to learn, what has the trend line been on for those students?
As Deputy Minister Curry said, the numbers have been fairly static over the last number of years with respect to children arriving at kindergarten who are ready to learn. A 0.4% decrease between last year and the previous year, but generally steady in the high 50s. But once they've gone through kindergarten, the students exiting kindergarten that are ready to learn, just under 80%. So there's some significant improvement in our target, as Deputy Minister Curry had said, was 90% of students exiting kindergarten ready for learning in the primary grades. So there's been some very good work done, and certainly more work that needs to be done in that area, but some pretty good progress. Yeah, and mind, it's a half-time learning program as well, right, for the most part. So.
Thank you. Just wanted to check in with regard to curricular renewal. any report would be welcome. I specifically wanted to ask about the secondary social sciences curriculum.
Hello, Susan Edelko-Vanderson, Assistant Deputy Minister. I'll be pleased to answer some of your questions on curriculum development and renewal. We have some very active files happening with curriculum development and renewal currently. We have 3 subject-specific reference committees, one in the area of practical and applied arts, one in the area of secondary arts education, and one in the area of secondary social sciences. Those reference committees have made recommendations for those specific subject areas, and so there is quite a bit of work happening in the area of secondary arts education with finishing up the renewal in that area, as well as some brand new provincial offerings in secondary arts education. Practical and applied arts, the same process is being used there, where we are renewing all of the existing documents that we have offered for practical and applied arts, as well as some new provincial offerings. And in terms of secondary social sciences, the reference committee has made some recommendations. We have presented those recommendations to the Curriculum Advisory Committee for their consideration as well. And we're having conversations about next steps with the recommendations. In addition to those 3 active subject areas, we're also finishing up some of the renewal in the area of some of our language courses, as well as some English language arts elective courses as well.
Thank you for that. Specifically with regard to the secondary social sciences curriculum and the work of the reference committee, when was their report submitted?
The reference committee has not submitted a report. We've had meetings. Mm-hmm.
Recommendations had been forwarded.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll have to just check to see if I can find a date for you.
Thank you. In last year's budget, there was an allocation for $500,000 for, now I'm forgetting the name of innovation within education. I'm just wondering if you could provide an update on activity and spending of those funds.
That innovation framework included a number of the following components. The ministry established a strategic relationship with the Atlantic Rim Collaborative, ARC. I think you know that. There was a development of a memorandum of understanding with the Gonski Institute for Education, and that was also to support innovation. The collaborative planning for the Indigenous Education Symposium. There was the establishment of the Provincial Education Council, and that membership was invited. There was a number of people that were invited to join that organization. There was also the establishment of the Provincial Youth Council, which selected a number of students from grade 10 to 12 to participate in that, to provide advice, to be on issues that were important to students in high school.
Could you provide a breakdown of the costs associated, or how that $500,000 was allocated?
For you to have somebody have a look at it, so you're supposed to hold things up.
A quick question regarding lawsuits and litigation. Are there any lawsuits or litigation ongoing for the ministry, and if so, can you describe?
The Ministry of Education is involved with the consortium through the Canadian Minister of Education and CMAC with respect to the Copyright Committee to recover unpaid tariff fees paid to access copyright. There is a that was the what? Would you like to know the status of the lawsuit, or just? Okay.
Short details if you have them, sure.
Well, that's certainly a labor-intensive document discovery. That's the pretrial process that we're going through now with respect to a number of school divisions. We have, as you know, the longstanding Theodore Court decision, which has currently been appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. We've taken a position on that, and I think you know the details with respect to that particular piece of litigation. We're waiting for documents to be filed at the Supreme Court, and then that will be heard by the Supreme Court. There's a lawsuit class action lawsuit that's been commenced against the government with respect to the provincial school for the deaf. That was commenced in 2009. There's currently ongoing litigation. Well, I shouldn't say it's ongoing litigation. There has been litigation commenced by the CEF with respect to the delivery of French language education in the province, particularly around delivery of capital projects. Last year, the government, through the Ministry of Education, had negotiated a funding agreement, which was part of that, but the lawsuits that are currently underway relate to the provision of school capital for that division. Last year, we had signed a memorandum of understanding, which would see the construction of 3 new schools, one in Regina, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert over the next 6 years. And earlier this week, we announced our commitment to fulfill the first leg of that piece of litigation. We're also having some ongoing conversations with the CEF with regard to perhaps the provision of some educational space in the city of Prince Albert. I can keep going.
Okay, oh, keep going.
Gotta love lawyers. There is a lawsuit with respect to the Lac La Ronge Indian Band. That appeal really involves the federal government. The province wasn't involved in that, although there was an initial naming of the province, I think, in that litigation. Okay. There is, well, that's not. Actually commenced, right? We were advised in early September that there was an intent to proceed with the case management with respect to the Red Pheasant Day School and a lawsuit regarding the closure of the Bridge City College due to operational difficulties. And there's been no action taken on that file since it was initiated back in 1990. So that's the essence of the litigation.
Thank you. With regard to human rights complaints that have been launched that would impact the Ministry of Education, can you provide any detail on that?
We're not aware of any complaints that have been brought against the Ministry of Education through the offices of the Human Rights Commission.
Thank you. I'm going to move a little more properly into the votes, Minister. Looking at vote 5, sub 3, I'm going to move through the K-12 allocations. I note that under achievement and operational support, there is a $5 million increase there. Can you describe what that increase in allocation is directed towards?
You're right, there was a $5.305 million increase with respect to achievement and operational support. There was a $5 million increase for classroom supports for students that are eligible to be matched by the STF. There was a $200,000.208 million increase to support the innovation framework. There was $0.173 million general salary increase to support current SGEU increases. There was a $50,000 increase to support the Ability in Me project in Saskatoon. There was a $32,000 increase in CBO funding. That was offset by an $84,000 decrease from operational savings, $50,000 reduction as a result of discontinuance of the hub in Prince Albert, and a $24,000 decrease to transfer a half an FTE from achievement and operational support infrastructure branch to support the library accountability and administration unit.
Thank you. Can you describe the CBO funding that's allocated in this budget?
Particulars of the CBOs that were funded, is that what you're asking? Or
Direction that was provided with regard to that increased funding, or if it was allocated to a certain outcome or program?
There was a 1% increase in CBOs across the board in the budget. I can go through the categories if you like, just with respect to the number of CBOs associated with each category.
Categories
Sure.
would be good. Thank you.
Well, there were 6 CBOs that were providing anti-bullying programming. There was 43 CBOs providing child nutrition. There was 3 for curriculum. There was 1 providing support with respect to disability, 14 ISIP programs. Early learning and child care, there was 262. Education of students at high risk in traditional education settings, there was 1. education of students in hospitals, 3, education of students of the province, there was 2, education of youth in custody, there was 3, family literacy, 9, federal provincial agreement on French, there was 12, 19 Kids First programs, scholarships for students with vulnerable circumstances, there was 1, and student services and support, there were 2, for a total of 381 CBOs.
Okay. So Kids First comes out of a different allocation, or is that coming out of the K-12 achievement and operational support?
That comes out of the operational support, right? Right. Yeah, out of operational support.
Thank you. Moving on to school operating, there is a $34 million lift here in that allocation, or that subject line. Can you describe what that increase is meant to cover?
There was a $10.208 million increase to roll forward in the 1920 budget increase. There was $12.833 million increase to provide government year portion of the $22 million enrollment inflationary increase for the 2020-21 school year. The remaining 9.167 will be provided in the 21-22 budget year. There was $11.696 million increase to provide the government year-end portion of the $20.5 million CBA commitment for the 2021 school year, and the remaining 8.354 will be provided in the 21-22 budget.
Minister, the roll forward amount, can you describe that? I'm not sure I've heard that described that way before.
The difference between those and the reason that it's reported that way is the difference between the 5 months, the difference between the school year and the fiscal year. I just want to correct the record. You asked about the Kids First, and I indicated that came out of operational support. That's not where it comes out of, and I'll get you the correct reference.
Okay, thank you. And then in K-12 initiatives, there's a slight bump there, 2.2 million. Can you describe what is funded, or what that increase in funding is directed towards?
There was $855,000. That was an increase for the qualified independent schools to support increased enrollment. There was $614,000 for the increase for Sakeu High School to support increased enrollment. There was $469 million. That was an increase for the historical high schools to increase provincial funding from 70 to 80% to, as I mentioned in my opening comments, to match the funding for qualified independent schools. There was $133,000. That was an increase to CBO funding. $119 million increase for Ranch Arlo to support contractual obligations. There was $84,000 increase for Cornwall Alternative Center so that the budget reflects the contractual obligations. Yeah, that's it.
Minister, overall, for operations in K-12, when you pull out capital, as you noted, there's about a $42 million increase. 20 million, I believe you said, and it was reported in the budget documents for the cost of the collective agreement with the teachers, leaving 22. What is the projected enrollment for the fall, increase in enrollment?
Enrollment increase will be 2,087 approximately. That's based on information that we received from the school divisions.
And how much, what was factored in for inflationary factor for the increased costs, non-teachers agreement costs that boards will realize in the following year?
There was just give me a second. $2 million additional in the budget is intended to address both inflation and enrollment pressures within the school division, noting that the major driver in school divisions with respect to the budget is really the CBA increase.
But you've booked more for inflation and growth than for the CBA increase. Okay. Broken out, how much is allocated of that $22 million strictly towards growth? So those additional 2,087 students.
So $12 million is allocated for enrollment growth, with $10 million allocated to inflation. And again, noting that one of the significant drivers with respect to additional costs within school divisions is the CBA. So,
Okay. So normally when we're in estimates, Minister, we're a little earlier in the year, so we don't have access to the budget submissions of school divisions when we're in estimates. But this year we do. And I note that a number of school divisions, in fact, all of those that I've had an opportunity to look at in any detail, are indicating that the amount that's been allocated has fallen short of their costs for basic growth and inflation. I think a number of divisions have had to dip into reserves this year, perhaps not as deeply as they did last year. I'm just wondering, of the budget submissions that you've received, how many of those divisions are indicating a deficit with the amount that they've received from the ministry?
As you know, school division budgets aren't due until the ministry until the end of June. I haven't seen the budgets yet, so I can't give you an answer to that. I can certainly undertake to provide that number to you.
I would appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You bet.
I certainly have noted a number of those school divisions that have their budget submissions online at this time have indicated, again, that they have had to either find cuts. We've seen cuts to cleaning staff in some, custodial staff in some divisions, cuts to FTEs, or relying on reserves to maintain status quo service provision and provision of education to students. Well, perhaps you don't have the formal submissions from school divisions. Have you received any indication in terms of the adequacy of the amount that's been forwarded in terms of covering their actual costs?
Information that I have is what I've read in the media with respect to potential deficits. I also note that prior to the end of June, in addition to expecting to receive the formal budgets, we also expect to have the school divisions advise us in terms of what their savings have been over the last number of months, not having to provide in-class services. We know school divisions have in some cases saved significant amounts with respect to plant operations, with respect to transportation and other things. So notwithstanding the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that the government didn't reduce any of the grant funding to those school divisions so as to ensure that payroll continued to be paid through that period of time and that people continued to be paid, notwithstanding that in-class school wasn't provided. We know that there are going to be some savings in some school divisions, and we're very interested in looking at those numbers in the context of the budgets that they provide before the end of the year.
Minister, can you please provide an indication of what your expectation is for those savings within school divisions for that March to June period?
Some preliminary information with respect to the school divisions and what they had saved. What we were encouraging school divisions to do is to ensure that, to the extent that they could, ensure that those savings were made available, or were certainly accounted for. We had, and we knew that there was going to be some savings in a number of areas. I can give you some numbers with respect to the school divisions, the number of school divisions in terms of the savings, but we were encouraging school divisions to ensure that, to the extent that they were having savings, that they would be careful with respect to those savings, noting that there would be certainly perhaps some additional costs that will be incurred by the school divisions as a result of having to return to school in the fall. I think I made that clear in the comments I've made. Here's just a number of school divisions that have had some significant savings, and these are the ones that we know to date. Good Spirit School Division, $1.9 million, $843,000 for Lloydminster Public, $1.74 for Prairie Spirit, 1.2 almost for Sask Rivers, Saskatoon Public School Division, $3.4 million, and Southeast Cornerstone, almost $2 million. So it's almost $11 million worth of savings just from those 6 school divisions. So we heard from Regina Public that there was going to be a savings of about $3.2 million, and certainly those funds will be available to school divisions as they move forward. And we were encouraging school divisions to make sure that they were accounting for those funds so that they could be available for. Certainly our intention to make sure that in terms of in-class learning this fall, that in-class instruction isn't going to be hampered, and so we know that some of those funding will be used to help offset additional costs that school divisions are going to have.
You, Minister, would you be able to table those amounts and endeavor to table the future amounts as you get them from divisions? Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So with regard to those savings or those unspent funds to this point, Minister, how have school divisions been directed with regard to how they may or may not use those funds?
What the Deputy Minister of Education has indicated to school divisions is that the savings could be used on one-time initiatives such as IT purchase renewals, repair and maintenance projects for buildings, and renewal of bus fleets. We were encouraging school divisions not to use those for creating or enhancing programs of an ongoing nature, given the ongoing requirement for funding for those programs. So one-time savings and perhaps one-time initiatives. So, but we've also asked school divisions to be very careful, noting that there will be presumably some additional costs in terms of providing educational services this fall.
So it can be used for one-time purchases, and I would presume by the end of their fiscal year?
Well, not necessarily, and there may well be some school divisions that choose to take some of that money and put it into reserves. There's no requirement for them to spend that money, and as a matter of fact, we're encouraging them to make sure that they are prepared for this fall. So perhaps I can give you an example. I know that Saskatoon Public, who had initiated a fairly unique program with regard to online delivery, used a number of their existing computers that they had to distribute them to members of the community, students, so that they could engage in online learning. And one of the requests of us was, they wanted to renew that inventory, not knowing how much of it was going to come back or what kind of shape it was going to be when it came back. And so those kinds of things. But certainly, to the extent that that division was encouraging online learning, that was a useful initiative for them.
Thank you. So purchases, not FTEs, though?
No, these were really going to be one-time expenditures. So the suggestion that perhaps more FTEs be retained in the interim would be an ongoing cost. We were discouraging that. But it may well be that in terms of ongoing provision of educational services in the fall, they may want to utilize that, but obviously that's going to have some effect on future budgets in terms of their FTEs.
With regard to those increased costs that you anticipate school divisions will be incurring in the fall, do you have an indication of a number for what those costs will look like?
We don't. Certainly one of the challenges, I think, right, that we don't know what additional costs will be. One element of that will be meeting the number of the requirements that the Chief Medical Health Officer has put forward in terms of his guidelines. Any extra expenses that are occasioned as a result of the implementation of those guidelines will have to be considered, and that may well certainly differ from one school division to another school division if there are any additional costs at all. And so that's precisely the reason why there was no additional funds in the budget, why there's a contingency fund put in the budget to help deal with some of the effects of COVID-19, not just within the education sector, but other sectors as well. And so we're not, at the present time, aware of what those costs might be. Certainly the response planning team, in conjunction with the ministry and with school divisions, will make some determination as to what those additional costs will be as we get closer to school, because we really don't know. While we have a set of guidelines the Chief Medical Health Officer has put forward, those guidelines may well change before September, either for the better or not. And so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to put a cost on what those additional costs may be.
Is there a scenario under which there wouldn't be a requirement, for example, additional PPE or perhaps additional busing or additional funding for cleaning or cleaning staff?
Well, I think under the guidelines, it's fair to say that there will certainly be some additional requirements with respect to cleanliness in the schools. That's clear. In terms of personal protective equipment, the guidelines as they currently stand, the Chief Medical Health Officer is not recommending or suggesting that personal protective equipment will be a requirement in the fall, again.
For bus drivers, for
right,
example.
That may well all change. We're certainly hoping that school returns in as normal a fashion as possible, but certainly things will be a little bit different this fall. We're hoping not significantly different, but that really depends on the circumstances. And so we need to be very kind of proactive in terms of analyzing what the situation is, and we'll be working with the Chief Medical Health Officer to determine whether or not there are any changes in those guidelines. But the work that's being done by the response planning team in terms of how those guidelines will be implemented, how they will affect any one particular school or any one school division, certainly be something that needs to be worked on between them, the ministry, and the school divisions.
Are there any divisions that are indicating to you that they won't require additional funding to implement those guidelines?
We've heard anecdotally through the media that there may be some requests, but we've got no official request for any of that at the present time, but there's certainly been some conversations. Just as a matter of that the Regina Public had made a suggestion, I think it was last week, that the additional costs of providing those services in the division based on the guidelines would be about $500,000, but and they had said that they would be taking that out of their savings. But again, it's too early to tell in terms of what those additional costs would be across school divisions.
So, Minister, in a number of other jurisdictions in Canada, other provinces, we see that the planning for fall involves, in many cases, reduction in class sizes. That isn't something that is contemplated or isn't set out in our guidelines here. Can you walk me through why that option or that scenario isn't on the table in Saskatchewan?
We know that in a number of provinces, that's one scenario. You'll note, and I know you've read the guidelines from the Chief Medical Health Officer. He is not recommending that at the present time. So there may well be a change in that direction depending on where we are come September. But at the present time, and as I said, our clear intention, and I think the comments that have come from the Chief Medical Health Officer makes this very clear, that his guidelines aren't anticipating reduced class sizes this fall, certainly to the fullest extent possible, social distancing and the kinds of other things that he suggested in his guidelines will move forward. But again, Chief Medical Health Officer hasn't recommended that, and to the extent that the response planning team may well be working on, and I know they are, on different scenarios depending on the circumstances. We'll play that by ear come September, but at the present time we're not anticipating any reduction in class sizes.
Presumably, if there were a shift to reduced class sizes, for example, or a hybrid model of reduced class sizes and online learning, that would have a significant increase in cost for school divisions. they are finalizing and submitting budgets right now. How do divisions pivot in that scenario, both in terms of reorganizing their plans, but also and also in terms of covering increased costs?
Let Deputy Minister Curry just talk a little bit about the work that's being done from the response planning team side.
Thanks, Minister. So as was already referenced, we will be taking our guidance from the Chief Medical Health Officer in terms of planning for the fall. And right now, we have received indications that we want schools to be as normal as possible. And as such, with our respective planning and the response planning team, which has membership and representation from SSBA, STF, SASBO, the business officials and leads, as well as the ministry. And this group coming together are looking at what are the implications and the suggestions for moving forward to address the reality of having students begin their education journey back in the school sites. So we have taken the leadership that's been provided by the Chief Medical Health Officer and the guidance that has provided our institution guidelines that are in the Reopen Saskatchewan document that is posted on the Saskatchewan.ca website. And in that document, it speaks to the resumption of class structures as we know them, with the focus on looking to minimizing as best as possible the distancing in a safe way with regards to the students and the staff. That planning, as we know it right now, 2.5 months out from when students return to the sites, is such that we have an interest and an opportunity to ensure that we resume what we know to be normal, but at the same time be cognizant of the fluidity of prospective change. So right now we have so many of our students who have been working on the last 3 months remotely. All students have been working remotely. But with the resumption of returning to the school sites, looking for a safe, engaging, and welcoming site for them to resume their education journey. So the response planning team is taking into account the direction provided by the Chief Medical Health Officer in terms of what the hygiene, what the physical contact, the equipment, the sanitization processes will be, as well as transportation in terms of what one must take into account in the preparation for these students. In addition to that, we've also looked at the learning program for the resumption of school in the fall. And so that's been provided to the school divisions as well, who are taking these overarching considerations into account as they are planning as we speak for the return of students coming into their respective sites. And some have learned over the course of these last few months of what might be possible, and some have learned what is considered to be returning to that prospective way of offering education. And many have learned as well the significance of pivoting, I'll call it, when a situation presents itself. So the school divisions are working with the response planning team to work under the framework of, should COVID-19 present itself in any one of our respective sites, how would one respond to that? And how would one form the communication structure with our parents and our students and our staff as well? So right now, again, coming back, Chief Medical Health Officer has provided the guiding principles from which we're working. The response planning team is looking from the perspectives of their education sector partner perspective and bringing that to the table to look at affirm what's working, to look at the what ifs if needed, and how we would actualize an action towards supporting the school divisions moving forward.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Minister, I think there is a lot of concern remains about who pays and where that funding comes from. Can you provide an answer to that? With the already known existing costs, increase in costs that are going to be incurred in the fall, in really the best case scenario, let alone what happens if we have a localized outbreak or a more general outbreak or a second wave. I think that certainly a lot of the folks that I've been talking to are looking for reassurances that those costs will be covered. And that's not immediately clear, given the budget that's allocated here, how that's going to happen. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, please.
Well, I've indicated on a number of occasions the fact that there's a $200 million contingency fund in the budget to help deal with the consequences of COVID-19. That's certainly money that's available in the budget to help offset additional costs. And I've also said that there's been some significant savings in school divisions that they can use to help offset those costs. So without knowing what those costs are, certainly it's the intention of the government to ensure that classroom learning is not impacted by COVID-19, and that to the extent that additional resources will be required, having regard to the contingency fund that we do have and the additional money that school divisions have saved, those will be the resources that will be available.
And given the guidelines as they sit now, which really are, hopefully, and fingers crossed, this is a scenario we find ourselves in the fall. This is really a best case scenario in terms of a return to school in the fall. There are going to be increased costs here. If you have a staff member who has symptoms of COVID, before they're testing, they're going to be utilizing subs, for example. You have additional requirements, as I've said, for cleaning, for sanitizer, probably additional supervision costs, the way that schools are provide supervision over lunch hour now, for example. Where are those known costs going to come from? I mean, that contingency, Minister, is not just for the Ministry of Education. Is that correct?
It's a contingency for executive government.
Right.
Well, as I've said before, there are some significant savings in school divisions. The Regina Public School Board has said these additional costs with respect to what has been set out in the guidelines to date are about $500,000. There may well be some other expenses that are incurred. You're right. There could be some teachers who are immune compromised that are going to have to be replaced in the classroom. I agree with that. But again, there are some significant savings in school divisions we're going to expect them to utilize, and they have access to the contingency fund, which is in the budget. So it's difficult at this particular point in time, and I think you agree with me, to determine exactly what the costs of any additional measures will be. But I can tell you that we will be working with school divisions through the response planning team to make sure that the delivery of education in the classroom isn't impaired.
So I think what I want to do, Minister, I note the time we're going to move through some of these guidelines and just ask some questions as they have occurred to me, or questions and concerns have been raised with me as the critic for education. Reading from the primary and secondary educational institution guidelines, school-age children return to regular activities, including programming and activities to now allowable under Reopen Saskatchewan. I think we've canvassed that. And classes beginning as early as September 1st, depending on local school division calendars. Is there any additional professional development that you anticipate will be required before this reopening in this new reality?
Part of the response planning team's ongoing conversation. This last Thursday is when these guidelines were released, and given the guidelines now known, we have conversation with the school divisions and the response planning team as to what does that mean, how do we prepare our communities, from our administration, staff, students, and parents as well. So as we go through what the realities may be, not only now as we know them and in preparation, so there has been ongoing, I've heard from a few school divisions who are developing their respective plans to welcome the students back into the school sites here in September, and they are working on that. As well, it will be a fluid situation that through the month of July and into early August to understand what in fact it will be. So as we know it now, the school divisions, as well as continued conversation and guidance from the response planning team, appreciates that we are planning as we know the situation to be right now. We take into account that there are ways to provide learning opportunities for our staff, and what those may be dependent upon what the situation will be known to be into August as to how we address those in preparing our staff for the realities. So I don't think that our school divisions are planning, but they're trying not to get too far out in front of a situation, knowing there's significant potential change that may be realized here over the next number of weeks.
So I guess I'll back up a bit and go back to the question that I asked previously in terms of, what's been presented here is one scenario, sort of a best case scenario for the fall. Other provinces have looked at, providing guidelines or direction to boards that anticipate for the most part, three different scenarios, so sort of exclusively online return to school should there be a second wave of COVID-19, a return to school, and then a hybrid model with reduced class sizes and online. Could you walk me through the reasons why we only see one scenario in front of us right now?
Contact with our other jurisdictions across the country as to how they're approaching this, and there is knowledge and there is variation, and in all cases there is an approach to students returning to the school sites. And so the beauty of our structure right now is that we have committed to students returning to the school sites, with each of the school divisions having contingency plans in place to address the fluidity of the situation of COVID as it may present itself throughout the province in the months ongoing when school resumes. Other provinces have chosen, and other jurisdictions have chosen to have phase 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it speaks to the same reality that students are returning, but we will respond based on the situation of the day as to whether they be working remotely or they be working in the school site and how they would be attended to. The beauty of our structure is that, and the strength of our structure is that we are the same as everybody else. Students are returning. And school divisions, with ongoing conversations with the response planning team, will be making plans for contingency. How do we respond to areas even within one community or areas within the province that would be evidence of the COVID, and how would we respond to that? So while on paper it may not show phases, our reality is students are in, but we have that planning that is taking place from a school division's perspective that will address and respond to the reality of the presence of COVID.
Thank you for that answer. Minister, certainly within those scenarios, within this scenario, there will be wild deviation in terms of costs and workload required of staff in those schools. And I guess I will move on, but one of the main questions, as I have asked, here today, and I continue to hear, is who is going to pay for those costs, or where will those costs come from? And the costs, perhaps, if this is the scenario that we have, can be absorbed with some of those savings you've described. But if we move into a scenario where we have a full lockdown or a hybrid model, those will come with significantly increased costs. And I guess I'm looking for some really reassurances for those who are concerned about that increased workload and the that the funds will be there in order to support it.
I'll just make two comments, because I think the Chief Medical Health Officer has made it pretty clear that he is not expecting further lockdown of schools in the fall. I think he said that publicly. And what I've said publicly is that it's not the expectation of the Ministry of Education that teachers in classrooms be responsible for anything more than their in-class learning. So that while there are some people that like to preach doom about this, the fact of the matter is it's not the expectation that teachers will teach in the classroom during the day and provide online learning to those students who aren't in their classroom. We know that there will be children who won't be in the classroom. We will expect the school divisions to develop strategies in terms of ensuring that educational opportunities, equitable educational opportunities, are delivered to children who aren't in classrooms. And so, as I say, we leave that up to the school divisions to make those decisions. But as I've said, it's not, it's the position of the government that we don't want to see any impact to student learning, and to the extent that there are additional costs, we have made provisions in the budget for that.
Who will be providing the learning to those students who will not be able to come into the classroom either for the duration of the school year or on a school-by-school basis or region-by-region basis?
I'll let Deputy Minister Curry speak to that.
So the response planning team has continued to look at options for children that will not, students that will not be in the classroom. So there are a number of options available to one. One is we presently have a number of entities, school divisions who offer online learning. So that is a remote opportunity that's structured to address students who are working outside of the school building. We also have the option of there's home-based learning as well, that for students who are not in the school building, that is an option that is to be considered or may be considered by a family. And then we also have school divisions based on student wellness and health that may structure another opportunity or another situation where they are supportive of a student who is not on site learning that way. So those are some options that are being reviewed, discussed, and continue to be considered as we move forward in our planning for what may be in the fall.
Thank you. I'm going to back it up a little bit again, and with regard to the uptake of students who did participate in the supplemental learning, how do you have a percentage of students who sort of initially signed up or indicated that they would participate in that supplemental learning, and what were the attendance numbers by the end of June?
The only numbers that we have currently was the uptake in April, which was about 85%, as the Deputy Minister has just informed me. But I can tell you that what the Deputy Minister is doing, and he can elaborate on the work that the Ministry is doing to do an evaluation of the participation levels and the impact that has had in terms of the educational opportunities that were provided through the supplementary learning models. Because what we really want to do, because this was thrust upon us pretty quickly, so we want to learn the lessons, and we want to know what we learned, what was good about it, what was bad about it, because we need to be able to incorporate those lessons into any additional supplementary work that's going to be done in the fall in terms of supplementary learning. And so we need to learn those lessons, and I know Deputy Minister Curry can comment a little bit about this, but this is the work that's being done by the Ministry right now. So we can do that evaluation, and we understand where things went well and where they didn't go so well. But we know the uptake, at least originally at the beginning of it, was quite high. We also know, I think it's fair to say, that it tailed off quite a bit, and you're probably aware of a lot of those situations. And so that's a critical area, right? Because if we're going to provide supplementary learning, we need to make sure that students are engaged, right? And so that work's being done by the Deputy Minister now. So Rob, I'm not sure if you want to make just another quick comment on that.
We were thrust into the response to the COVID-19 in March. But the fall we see as being different in that we have time to plan for it. And as such, education, and we have affirmed this with our school communities, education will continue in the fall. And learning will be provided. So our supplemental learning that we have experienced here over the last number of months will not be evidenced in the fall. It will be back to our learning. So in terms of that, we look to see that the level of engagement, once students return to the sites, once families feel reassured that there are a number of measures taking place to address safety, not only of the students but of the staff and the parents entering the school, we look to have that supported and realized, as well as reaffirm to our families all across the province that education will be continuing and will be structured in a way that will meet the health and well-being of our students and staff members, as well as the same time as work on ensuring that the education program continues. Most recently, on June the 15th, we had our education sector partners come together, again, under the guidance and leadership of the response planning team. We had representatives come across from all over the province to talk about lessons learned, as the minister has already referenced, and we wanted to capture what we've learned from this and what we can utilize for the future and keep in mind for future possibilities, but at the same time ensure that if there are any gaps, we address them. If there are any successes, we note them and we make sure that we continue on that path. So I was greatly pleased with the collaborative energy and spirit of our education sector partners who came together to co-facilitate this gathering and to have the lessons learned information presented to us that will guide and help us understand any changes that would be of benefit, should be brought in and considered and discussed.
I also just kind of want to add, and just to kind of highlight what Rob's already said, the exceptional work that's been done by teachers over the last number of months to ensure that, to the extent that children wanted to participate in supplementary learning, there's just some exceptional stories, and the teachers have just been remarkable. And the collaboration between the STF, the SSBA, and the ministry in terms of what's being done at the response planning table has been exceptional work. Certainly having that thrust upon us, not really having a playbook. These guys wrote a pretty good playbook, you know, given the circumstances, and so we'll learn from that and we'll develop our playbook as we go forward so that when we get to the fall with the work that's being done, and as I say, it's been, the collaboration has just been outstanding. And we've heard a lot of good things, but lots of lessons to learn. Leads is also part of that, sorry.
Thank you, Minister. And you'll have it on the record that you have my full agreement on that. The first paragraph, or I suppose the second paragraph in the document, notes that for younger children, maintaining physical distance is less practical and focus should be on minimizing physical contact. Instead, the precautionary measures within these guidelines will be implemented to reduce risk, standards, etc. Throughout this document, there is an emphasis on younger children and the reduced risk. I'm wondering how you're defining younger children. What's the age cutoff that you're talking about there?
No age cutoff. I think one of the things the Chief Medical Health Officer was giving some thought to is that, you know, children at a younger age are going to have a lot more difficulty understanding the concepts of physical distancing and those kinds of things. And so an emphasis on removing, you know, perhaps toys that children would play with that would pass around and concentrate on some other things that, so there's really no age limit that's kind of assigned to that. It's really going to be dependent, I think, on well, as I said, a lot of younger children aren't going to understand why they can't hug their teacher or why they can't hug their classmate, right? And so it's really going to have to be we're just going to have to kind of play this out as we go forward. But there's really we really haven't set time, but there will be a point in time, I think, where children kind of understand the concepts of social distancing as they get to be a little bit older. And so as those concepts become more understandable, that's when that can change a little bit, I think.
No, I appreciate that and certainly understand why that might be the case. I do wonder if there is, if the plan is predicated on the belief that younger children, varying reports of what age, 8 and under, 10 and under, might be less symptomatic or have a reduced transmission of COVID-19. Is that a belief that underpins these guidelines?
I think that's really what the Chief Medical Health Officer has said.
Those who are over 15, which would be all of our staff and the majority of high school students, I don't know that there's any indication of that reduced risk of either, well, certainly not of transmission, and certainly a number of staff would be, susceptible due to age or conditions. I'm wondering. Well, I guess the first question would be, how many people over 15 do we have in our buildings, staff and students? So when we're looking at social distancing, limiting physical contact, I understand that for younger people that's going to be more difficult. But it does mention things like wherever possible, physical distancing should be maintained. How is that going to happen in classrooms where we have 20, 30, 40, one case 50 students? How does that happen?
I think the operative words there are wherever possible, and the Chief Medical Health Officer hasn't indicated, I think, that the number of people in the classroom is necessarily a medical health risk, right? So we know that I can't answer the question as to how many children are 15 years of older. Presumably everyone in a high school is going to be over the age of 15 years old. I don't have those numbers. I suppose we could undertake to get them for you, but by the same token, children over the age of 15 years old will understand the concept of minimizing contact, right? And so that within schools, whether there's special pathways created, whether there's staggered entrances to the schools, those kinds of things, those will all be implemented to ensure that contact between individuals is minimized to the fullest extent possible. But the Chief Medical Health Officer certainly hasn't said that the number of children or people in a classroom is necessarily a medical health issue. Restrictions that have recently taken place with regard to the ongoing restrictions, it certainly seems to indicate that that is less of a concern to him as we go forward and we continue to reopen the economy.
My understanding, I mean, we sit in this building here where we have reduced the number of members to 15 from 61 due to concerns about our health and the health of those in the building. This obviously is much bigger than any classroom that you're going to find in the province, Minister. I'm just, I mean, these are the concerns that are being brought forward by both parents and staff in schools. If there is no risk of transmission, on surfaces in closed quarters where people are spending more than 15 minutes together in the same room, I think that would be information that people would like to hear about.
The number of people now that are allowed under medical health orders has significantly increased over the last little while, and so I think that to the extent that classrooms can be reconfigured to ensure that there is some modicum of distance between people in the classrooms, I think that that's something that school divisions we'll look to. But again, in terms of the number of people that are allowed in any one particular place, the Chief Medical Health Officer hasn't said that come September that's an issue. And so I think as long as he's suggesting that the number of children in a classroom isn't a health challenge, then I'm not sure, we're certainly prepared to continue to follow the guidance that's given to him. I think if you have any specific questions with respect to the rationale or the reasoning behind the decisions that he's made, we're certainly willing to take those questions up with the Chief Medical Health Officer.
Any of those that can't be answered here, I know that that would be appreciated. I note under limiting physical contact, there are a number of references to that, reducing the number of parents or encouraging parents not to attend schools. Avoid activities that require clustering around a particular item or small area. Procedures for entering the building, limiting pickups and drop-offs to one parent or guardian. And I quote, wherever possible, physical distancing should be maintained within the same group. Consider modifying room configurations, separating tables to promote physical distancing. What I'm hearing from those who know their classrooms very well, that currently I have, and this is, I believe I've got the numbers right to quote, but there are many of them. I have 32 students in my classroom. I've done the math. I think we've got a lot of teachers who have taken out the yardstick, and to physically distance those students, I would be able to, perhaps have 12 of them in my classroom, depending on how big the classroom is. So I guess what I'm asking, because it's not clear to me, is the expectation, especially if we're talking in high schools where almost everyone is over 15, what is the expectation for distancing? I notice we still have to queue up in the cafeteria here at the legislature, 6 feet apart. Are there no such expectations for students and teachers in classrooms?
The health officer intends, and I don't want to put any words in his mouth, is that to the extent that you can physically distance, and that's something, and I think the guidelines speak to that, but certainly, just like any other workplace, there's been a number of initiatives or restrictions that have been relieved over the last number of, in fact, some that were announced just recently, where adults and children will be interacting, whether that's on the playground, whether that's in theaters, whether that's outdoor sports. So by the time we get to September, certainly, if things continue to progress the way they are, there will be a general return to normalcy in society. And so you'll see adults and children interacting in areas like theaters and malls and churches. And so I'm not sure that there's any different expectation with respect to schools. So it's to suggest that, and I don't know where in the guidelines he said 2 meters. Certainly his view, I think, and not to put words in his mouth again, that to the extent possible we should socially distance, and I think that that's a good lesson for all of us to take in our daily lives. But he's also said that he doesn't see the issue of class size to be a particular medical health challenge or a medical health issue, and so we will expect that children in classrooms will take the appropriate precautions, just like you and I will take in our everyday lives as we go forward. But as we continue to open up the economy and continue to relieve ourselves of the restrictions, there will be a lot more certainly opportunities for people to interact with each other, with playgrounds, with spray parks. I know that children are going to be interacting with each other in those kinds of areas, and they'll continue to do that over the course of the summer, and so not sure why we expect the classroom to be any different. But to the extent that people can continue in their daily lives, whether that's in a classroom or whether that's at work, to respect appropriate social distancing, cleanliness, and those kinds of things. I think we can expect that. But as I've said, I don't think the Chief Medical Health Officer sees the number of kids in the classroom to be a health challenge.
I guess two things I want to say. One, the clarification I'm seeking is that because they are young children, and if so, then what do we do about those who are over 15 and the staff in the schools? The second, with regard to your example, Minister, spray pads and parks, there are particular considerations with regard to the risk of transmission that come with being in close proximity with shared surfaces in a confined space for a period of time, and those are the concerns that are being brought forward.
I won't repeat the last answer that I gave, but an example of kids now being able to engage in contact sports, for instance, where they will be in close proximity with each other, and they will be. So those are good examples, and I think to the extent we're going to be returning to as close a normal situation as possible, I think that's what the Chief Medical Health Officer has indicated, and to the fullest extent possible, we should continue to respect some of the social distancing rules and as he said in his guidelines, to the extent possible. And so we will expect schools and school divisions to implement those kinds of protocols that will do that. But again, I think that he is indicating that the number of children in a classroom is a particular issue. Now, it may well be that by the time we get to September, that may well change. So currently, I think just to rely on the guidelines of the Chief Medical Health Officer, who has given us excellent guidance over the last number of months, I think you'll agree. I'm not prepared to second guess the suggestions that he's made in those guidelines.
No, I wasn't asking to second guess, Minister. It was just a clarification on the assumptions, and again, was it specific to young children and what happens? I will move on. Looking at, again, I'm still under limiting physical contact. I believe I'm on the third page. Second bullet point, groups of students and staff members assigned to them should stay together throughout the day and not mix with other groups. Staff should remain within the same group whenever possible. Strive to minimize the number of different teachers and educational assistants that interact with groups of students throughout the day. Of course, this provides some difficulty for specialist teachers within elementary schools or pod teaching or group teaching, which we have embraced. But it becomes very, very difficult when we look at high school and the changing of, specialist teachers, subject area, different groups of students move, by the bell. They have 5 minutes to get to the next room. How does that work with the specialist teachers? How does that work with group teaching, and how does that work in high schools?
Deputy Minister Curry just mentioned speak about that from the response planning team perspective.
From the response planning team perspective, we've engaged with our school divisions on this topic here, and we recognize that there are changes afoot, and as a result of that, thank you for the reference with high school, and that has been a discussion point from the response planning team. So. Our school divisions are putting an effort and energy into planning for, as it says here in the guideline, strive to minimize. So if there are efforts and energies that can make the minimizing of interaction and the exchange, if we can minimize that, all the better. So we have had that conversation with the school divisions when they've asked about this, as well as the RPT, to just say, we're looking at, yes, we have existing structures to which we're all familiar, and we are looking for ways to strive to change that to ensure safety. What might that look like in your site? And it's been encouraging, seeing the glass as we have to. It's been encouraging that said, before in March, we didn't envision all 180,000 plus students of our province working remotely. That wasn't even in our paradigm. So when we go into this respective planning, as we understand it and know it to be, there are challenges. What ways can we strive to overcome those challenges and have the instruction happen? We appreciate and know that there are some students who will be working through their online options, and there may be other areas within the school facility or setting that might be accessible then, given the size of a class. But we are looking for the school divisions, as well as you referenced in high school there, to strive to how can we minimize that exchange, and we're working through with our school divisions right now to see how that can be evidenced.
It now being 5 o'clock, we'll recess for 1 hour, resuming at 6 o'clock. Thank you.